Hi, welcome back to CoderX Ankit and welcome back to the Spring Security course. So in the previous video, we have seen the authentication architecture in details. Now we are going to do some practicals and understand how this authentication is really getting authenticated and how the Spring Security knows that who is the user and from where it is collecting the user details, or you can say the username or password in real, right? So this will help us to understand the Spring Security context in Spring Security concepts in details, and we can override those settings and we can set up the Spring Security depending upon our needs, right? So now see, working with authentication and authorization. Okay, we are going to do some practicals. Of course, we will deep dive into the authorization as well, but that's not the right time right now, so we will deep dive, but just see what I'm saying here. Focus here. So see boss, with the default settings, okay, with default settings, or you can say with default configurations, okay, we have default user, right? We have one default user and default password, right boss? Default password generated by the Spring Security itself, okay, itself. Okay boss, we have already seen this in the previous videos. Like what I'm trying to say here, you just see, this is my Spring Security. Okay, see, this is my Spring Security enabled Spring Boot application. Okay, you just go to the pom.xml and check. Here we have added the Spring Boot starter security, and here we are adding the Spring Boot starter web. I have just created one controller over here. You can see the get mapping / welcome is the mapping URL, and you see welcome dear user, it is printing. Now when I'm trying to hit it after running this project, go to the main app and say run as a Spring Boot app. Fine. Now let me run it and go here. See, one password is generated in some encoded form right now boss. So this, when you hit this endpoint, it will say 401 unauthorized. Why boss? Because it is expecting this endpoint. Now our application is expecting one authorization header, right? So by default we have one user and we have one password associated with it. Now we have to give the details in the form of what was base 64 encoded version, right? So here a Spring Security is giving the user what was user only. Okay, user only, and password what was some generated password, right? Generated password, you got it. Here we have generated password here. In your system or whenever I will rerun the application, this password will be changed. Already seen that, we have already seen that, right? This is some password. Okay, so generated password, okay, and this password will change. This password will change if we rerun the application. Okay, this may change when we rerun the application. Fine. Now see, it will expect one header, that is authorization. We are not passing here right now boss. So what we will do, just say base 64. Okay, base 64 encode, go to encode, and here I will say user. The default username is user. Now you are having the user, right? Now you are having the password. Okay boss, this is the password. Copy this and go here and say paste. Okay, say, okay, it is refreshed, user and password. Now this user and password will be followed by one colon here. Now do what boss? Go and say encode. Okay, go and say encode. Now it is encoded. Now copy this encoded value, go to headers and say key just say authorization. Okay, and there here you just see basic space and then paste this is fixed prefix, right, and paste the value collected from the base 64 encoded value and then send it. It will say, now see, it is again saying what was 401 unauthorized, right? Because why? I am not just ticking over here, right? When I tick this, it means now I am sending the authorization. Now say send and say 200. Okay, welcome dear user, the message is printing now. It means fine. Here we have checked that okay, our application is hitting the endpoint correctly and it is securing our application as well. So this is the default configuration, that by the default configuration we have the user as user and password as this password that is generated in the and printed in the console. So what is happening over here, we have already seen about the authentication part in very much details, but let me just clear in very short form. So just request is going on, fine boss. Here now see request is coming from the client. Now here we have the main important part. I'm just okay, in the security filter chain there is authentication filter, right? Authentication filter, right? Already seen that, already explained all the things in very much of details, right now boss? So this request will be now filtering through this authentication filter. Now this authentication filter itself not does in itself not do. Now this authentication filter is not doing any work by itself. It is delegating the work to the authentication manager, right? Okay, so it is delegating the work to the authentication manager. Yes na boss? Okay, authentication manager. Now authentication manager, okay, it has like one implementing class. This is interface, right? It has one implementing class, provider manager. That provider manager means authentication manager itself has the multiple lists of what boss? It has the list of different authentication providers. So based upon the request containing data, okay, suppose I am giving username and password. So one username and password authentication will be doing some job, right? Authentication manager, authentication provider. So based upon the data that we are passing in the request, authentication manager will now authentication manager will now use authentication provider. Okay, here we are having, this is just very shorter version of the story that we have already discussed, right? So authentication provider is there. Now this authentication provider, here authentication filter is there. Okay, so authentication responsibility is delegated to authentication manager. Authentication manager will use the authentication provider and attempts authentication. Okay boss, here now the main question is, who will collect the user and password value, right? So this authentication provider, based upon the authentication method that we are using, okay, one authentication provider will come into the picture because there can be n number of authentication provider. Okay, username, basic, for a basic username and password there is username and password authentication provider, OAuth authentication provider. So this authentication provider collects the user details in the form of user details object. Okay boss, and one another component is there, that is password encoder. Okay boss, password encoder. These are the two important components that this authentication provider is using to collect the user details, means any user ID, username, okay, and password in encoded form. Okay, now after collecting the user details and password from the password encoder and user details from the user details object, or you can say the user details component, then this authentication provider will attempt the authentication, boss. Okay, once everything is fine, once everything is authenticated, now what happens, boss? So this authentication provider will tell, hey, authentication manager, I have done all the things. Okay, now this authentication manager will say, hey, dear authentication filter, take your request, I have done all the things. Now from here, what happened, boss? So from here, your Spring security context will be inflated. Spring security context, right? Security context object, this will be inflated here. Okay, in the what, was in the security context holder, security context holder. And we already seen that how this security context is inflating. Under this we have one authentication object, right? Under this again we have one authentication object, yes or no, boss? And this when this Spring security context holder is inflated with the security context object, then it means now the user is authenticated. If this security context is not inflated, then it means what, boss? The user is not what? The user is not what, boss? Just answer it, right? The user is not authenticated. So if Spring security context, this security context component is populated, it means now it's done. The job of authentication is done. But the main component that we need to understand is user details, and one is password encoder. That's the whole important point. That's the whole important point, boss. So how this user details and password encoder is working and helping the authentication provider? See here, that's the more important point. Okay, boss. So see, user details service. Okay, user details service and password encoder. Okay, now see, user details service and password encoder. What is this, boss? What is this? This is the main concept. See here, I will tell you what is user details. So first understand, user details service is an interface which manages the details about user. That okay, what is the username, what is the user ID? Okay, so these things will be managed by user details interface, boss. Okay, now it has one method. देखिए boss, see here, what is that method? Okay, open it and say user details service interface. Okay, 6.3.3 whatever, fine. Go to see, this is the interface. It is used throughout the framework as a user DAO, and it's a strategy used by the DAO authentication provider. Fine. See, go to method. It has only one thing. It has only one method, that is load user by username. Okay, it has one method, that is nothing but load user by username. That's the only thing. Okay, and see, a string username, it is saying, hey, please give me the username, then I will try to find whether this user is available or not. And see, what is the return type? The return type of the user is this load user by username method is user details. Fine, boss. So user details. Okay, Now it throws exception, boss. Okay, it throws user not found exception. If the user is not found, then it throws user not found exception. Yes, no, boss. So we need to focus here on the return type. The return type of the method is user details. Now user details is one interface. You just see here, implementations are not used directly by the Spring Security for security purposes. They simply store user information which is later encapsulated into authentication objects. All the details that are present inside this user details after successful authentication, all the details that present inside this object of the user details after successful authentication, what happened was that successful authentication, okay, after that all the user information is now encapsulated into the authentication object, right? We have already talked about that, how the authentication object get populated, and that authentication object, if that is populated, the security context will be populated, and if the security context will be populated, then automatically because security context holder is the holder of the security context, right? That's why we can say that our user is authenticated if our security context is authenticated, if our security context holder is inflated, or you can say populated, right? So that's the whole thing here. Now see, this user details contains some methods like get authorities, get password, get username, each account non-expired, each account non-logged, each credentials non-expired, each enabled. So these are the things over here. Returns the authority. So when you want to collect some user information, where you need to go, boss? From which component you need to ask? You need to ask the user details. You need to say, hey, I want the user details object. So that's why here what, boss? That's why here what? This authentication provider is asking, hey, where is the user details object, boss? Where is the user details object? Right? So user details service, okay, says, hey, I will manage the user. Fine, you just give me the username. So if the username successfully matched, then user details object will be returned. That's the whole thing, right, boss? So here you say it fetches the user based on the username and returns a fully populated user details object, including what was username, password, roles, if any roles are there associated, then okay. Next, also this service works with authentication manager for authentication process with these details, okay. Fine, boss. Now see here, here until now we are using the default implementation of user details service interface. Yes, boss. The main important thing is, if user details service is an interface which is there to give you the user details object, right? But who is giving the implementation of that interface? As a programmer, we are not writing explicitly till now, right now, boss? So it means Spring Security itself, but with the default configuration at the runtime, it will be giving some proxy class, and that proxy class object, you can say, okay, dynamically one object will be coming, right? So some proxy class will be generated for this user detail service interface. Yes, no, boss? Okay, we are not giving till now, we are not giving any kind of data, we are not giving any kind of implementations for this user detail service. Okay, fine. Now the default implementation registers default credentials. Yes, boss. Now if we are not giving any kind of explicit implementation, then it means what? A Spring Security will do, or Spring Security will register default credentials. We are not giving any kind of data, we are not giving any kind of user. And how we can give the user and username? With the help of this user details service. Now we are not giving the implementation of the user detail service, then who is giving? A Spring Security. Then a Spring Security has the full rights to just register one default user. That's why one default user is being registered. So the default implementation registers the default credentials in the internal memory of application. You can say in memory, right? But see, this way of registering credentials in memory application is not good. Okay, not good at all for production ready applications. So if you are really building one application for a client or in a company or for yourself, and you are expecting that it will go live, then this way will not work out at any cost. This is not the right way. Fine, that's the whole thing. And that's the simple thing about the user details service, that hey, so user details service is an interface. So user details service says, hey, I will just give you the very basic things, right? I will give you the user details object with very basic default user credentials. And again, now we have the password encoder, right? So see, understand the password encoder now. So password encoder. See, boss, we have the password encoder now. So the thing is, it is also an interface first of all. Now again, if it is an interface, then again we are not giving any kind of implementation. Right now, boss, see, go here, just go here, password encoder docs, or say interface. Okay, go here, API docs. See, this is password encoder. Now it has one method, that is encode, matches, upgrade encoding, right? And upgrade encoding is default boolean. Okay, this method. And you just see encode and matches are there. Now it is, if this is an interface, it means we are also not, right now, till now we are not giving any kind of implementation. So now what is the work of this encode? Fine, it mainly does two things only. It mainly does two things. A, the main thing is encode a password, and then B, verifies the password. That's the whole thing. Okay, it what it does, it just do encoding and matching. It means verifying. So encode a password, verifies the password. That's the whole thing here. So we will study more about this. We will study or learn, you can say, we will learn more about password encoder in details later on. This is not the right time to discuss password encoder. Okay, now see, boss, here, note, very important point. Note, with basic HTTP authentication with default configuration, okay, Spring Boot chooses what was, so Spring Boot chooses what was HTTP basic authentication method. Yes, chooses basic HTTP basic authentication method. Now what is this HTTP basic authentication method? This authentication method asks the client to send only two things, that is nothing but one, username, and second B is password was. That's why when we are sending the username and password in the encoded form, in the base64 encoded form as authorization header value with the basic keyword attached to it, that is fixed prefix here, basic, it means this is the basic HTTP basic authentication method, and in this HTTP basic authentication method the only main things are this username and password. So when you send it, it will verifies and it will authenticate the user. That's the whole thing. Okay, and how? Through it expects the username and password through authorization header, right boss? Authorization header, you got it? So that's why we are passing the authorization header and it is verifying our user. Okay, so in authorization header, what we are having boss? So as an example, we are having this, right? Basic and some data. So this is fixed, prefix, this basic is prefixed, so fixed prefix. Okay, and this is what? Base encoded username and password value, base 64 encoded user and password values, you got it, followed by the colon as well. Okay, now let me tell you the more important point about base 64. One very important note that is coming into my head. See here, note again, base 64 is just encoding method, not an encryption method boss, not an encryption or hashing method. So encryption and hashing are used to keep the data secured. This encoding, base 64 is just encoding method. Okay, this is just, anyone can decode that. Okay, when you just give this value, just copy this. Okay, just copy this value. Okay, copy this value and go to the base 64, say base 64 encode, go here, fine, go here, and here we were encoding it now just decode it. Okay, where boss? Encode, you just click on the decode, now just paste the value, and when you just say decode, okay, see user colon and the old password value that we were encoding it is coming or not. So anyone can easily decode it. If you can see this, if you just put out here, then you can easily get this password and username. So this is just the encoding method, not the encryption method boss. Encryption and hashing, salting, these are the some required important things that is like implemented at the database level. I mean the encrypted form of that password is kept into the database level, right? That's what I mean to say. So base 64 is just encoding method, not the encryption method, not the hashing method. Fine boss. Now see, it is just there. Then why it is there? So it is just there for convenience Okay boss, convenience of transit means data traveling. Okay, transit of credentials. Okay, that's it. Now see, anyone can decode these base 64 encoded values and see the credentials easily. And I also showed you, right? Yeah, okay boss. Now see here, after this, HTTP basic authentication does not provide confidentiality to the credentials, boss. That's the more important point here, right? So HTTP basic authentication does not ensures the confidentiality to the credentials, because we just seen that anyone can decode that, right? So in production level application or real time application, we do not use HTTP basic authentication method as authentication process. You got it, boss? In our authentication process, we do not use this HTTP basic authentication. Okay, now in the next video, I will let you know how you can configuring Spring Security. I will teach you how you can configure the Spring Security based upon your requirements and customize the configuration so that you can achieve the desirable results in your application for security at application level. Fine. So I hope till here it's fine, and thank you so much for watching today's videos. Let's meet in the next video. Bye bye.